In the summer of 1849, a wagon party climbing into the high country west of the South Pass stopped to fill their barrels from a mountain stream running clear and cold and fast over pale stone, water that looked, by every account written down afterward, cleaner and purer than anything those travelers had drunk since leaving the muddy rivers of the lowlands behind them. They boiled their coffee the same way they always had, the same pot, the same fire, the same rough count of minutes they had used at every camp since Missouri, and within a matter of days a good number of that party were doubled over with cramping and a watery sickness that would not let up, weak, dehydrated, some of them dangerously so, in country with no doctor for hundreds of miles in any direction. The party blamed the thin mountain air. They blamed the sudden change in altitude. They blamed bad luck, and a few of them, I'm sorry to tell you, blamed nothing at all, because they never made the connection between that beautiful, clear, cold stream and the sickness that followed. And some parties on that same stretch of trail in that same season made that exact same mistake more than once before anybody worked out what was actually happening. Thirst gets the credit and dirty water gets the blame for a great deal of what happened to travelers crossing this country in those years, and in a certain narrow sense, water was indeed the cause. But it was never the muddy, brown, obviously suspect water that did the worst of the damage to careful travelers, the kind of water any sensible person already knew to treat with caution. It was water exactly like that mountain stream, clear, cold, moving fast over clean stone, water that looked, by every honest visual measure a traveler had available to them, as safe as water could possibly look. And it was not merely the water itself, it was a piece of plain physics almost nobody on that wagon train understood, a fact about their own cook fire and their own mountain that meant the very method they trusted to make water safe was quietly failing them in exactly the country where they trusted it most. Here is the twist, and I want you to sit with it before we go any further, because it is the whole spine of what I am handing you tonight. Clear water is not safe water, and I want to say that as plainly as I possibly can, because it runs directly against what nearly everybody's own eyes tell them every single time they look at a mountain stream. The organisms capable of putting a grown man on his back for a week or more are, without exception, far too small for any human eye to see, and a stream can run gin clear over the prettiest stone in the country, while still carrying exactly the kind of contamination that took down that wagon party in 1849. And boiling that water, the one method those travelers actually trusted, was not automatically enough to fix the problem either, not because boiling itself is unreliable, but because of a specific physical fact about mountain country that most people then and now have never once had explained to them. What that wagon party was trying to do has a plain name. It is called making water safe to drink using nothing but a fire and a pot, and doing that correctly requires understanding two separate pieces of real knowledge working together, not merely one. I am going to walk you through both of those pieces tonight, honestly and completely, because this is knowledge that matters just as much to a person filling a bottle from a mountain creek today as it mattered to a wagon party crossing that same high country 170 some years ago. If you found yourself today filling a container from a stream that looked as clean and clear as any water you had ever seen, most people, without ever having been taught otherwise, would trust exactly what that wagon party trusted. That clear water from a source far from any obvious town or farm is probably safe, and that boiling it for a rough, unmeasured stretch of time, however long felt sufficient in the moment, would finish the job of making it safe if any doubt remained at all. That is the knowing we are digging back up tonight, neighbor. Not simply that water needs boiling, which most people already understand in some rough way, but exactly why clarity tells you nothing useful at all, and exactly what boiling actually has to accomplish, in terms any person can understand and act on, to genuinely do its job. We will get to every bit of it honestly, because I intend to give you real, usable knowledge tonight, rather than a vague old warning to be careful around water. I am Ezra Calhoun, and I have spent my whole life on a stretch of Ozark ground. My family has worked for the better part of 200 years, back in a hollow we still call Calhoun Hollow, tucked into the Missouri backcountry country, with its own share of clear, cold springs and creeks that my own family has drawn from for generations. My grandfather Gideon, raised me on that ground, and he was born in 1919 and lived to be 89 years old, and he carried a particular careful respect for water that ran deeper than most people's, because he had lost a close family friend as a young man to a sickness that friend picked up from water that, by every account Gideon ever gave me, looked as clean as any water either one of them had ever seen in their lives. That loss shaped how Gideon thought about water for the rest of his long life, and it shaped in turn exactly what he drilled into me from the time I was old enough to fill a canteen on my own. By the time we are through here tonight, you will understand precisely why the clarity of water tells you nothing reliable about whether it is safe to drink, a fact that runs against instinct so strongly that even careful, sensible people still fall for it regularly today. You will know exactly what kind of contamination tends to hide in the clearest, most pristine looking mountain water, and why remote, seemingly untouched country is not automatically the safe country it appears to be. You will know the honest, documented signs a body gives after drinking contaminated water, including a genuinely important detail about timing that trips up a great many people, even when they do get sick. You will know the specific, correct method for boiling water to make it genuinely safe, including a piece of real physics tied directly to elevation that the old wagon parties crossing this country had no way of understanding, and that a great many people today still get wrong. And you will know the honest history of why this knowledge, once necessary for every single household in this country, quietly became something most people no longer needed to think about at all. A story with no villain in it, only genuine progress doing exactly what it was supposed to do. That is where we are headed tonight, piece by piece, and I'm leaving nothing out. There are 6 pieces to understanding how to actually make water safe using nothing but honest observation, a fire, and a pot, and I want every single one of them to leave you better equipped than that wagon party in 1849. Whether you are filling a bottle on a mountain trail this year or simply want to understand a piece of history that still matters today. 6 in order, and the order matters because the first piece has to break a piece of instinct almost everybody carries before the rest of tonight's lesson can make proper sense. The first 2 pieces explain exactly why clear water fools people and why the most pristine looking country is not automatically the safest. The middle pieces cover the honest signs the body gives afterward and the specific mistake that keeps this danger alive today. And the 6th piece is the actual physics behind boiling correctly, a piece of real science that explains exactly what went wrong for that wagon party climbing into high country in 1849. The first piece is understanding plainly why the clarity of water is not a meaningful measure of its safety, because this single fact runs against one of the strongest and most natural instincts a person carries into the outdoors. And breaking that instinct is the whole foundation everything else in tonight's lesson rests upon. When people judge water by sight, they are understandably looking for sediment, cloudiness, discoloration, or visible debris, signs their own eyes are genuinely well equipped to detect, and the absence of those signs feels quite reasonably like a strong indication that the water in front of them is clean. The trouble is that the organisms actually responsible for the most common and most serious waterborne illness, single-celled parasites, bacteria, and viruses, are almost without exception far too small to be seen by the naked human eye under any circumstance, present in numbers more than sufficient to make a person seriously ill while contributing absolutely nothing visible to the water's appearance, taste, or smell. A stream can run perfectly clear, cold, and seemingly pure while carrying exactly the kind of microscopic contamination that put that wagon party on their backs, because clarity and microscopic safety are quite simply 2 entirely unrelated properties of water that human vision was never built to distinguish between. Here is the piece that makes this especially dangerous rather than merely inconvenient. Because clear water genuinely looks, and in most cases tastes, indistinguishable from truly safe water, people trust it more readily than they trust visibly murky or discolored water, precisely backward from where real caution ought to sit. if visual appearance actually correlated with safety, the way instinct suggests it should. A traveler filling a bottle from muddy river water already carries some built-in wariness, boiling it thoroughly, or filtering it carefully out of simple, sensible caution. That same traveler filling a bottle from a beautiful, clear mountain stream very often skips that same caution entirely, precisely because the water looks so obviously, reassuringly clean, and that misplaced confidence is exactly what makes clear water, counterintuitively, one of the more dangerous categories of water a person can encounter, not because it is more likely to be contaminated than any other water source, but because people are far less likely to treat it with the caution its actual invisible contents may genuinely require. So the first piece is this, and I want it to sit with you plainly because it has to replace an instinct most people have never once had reason to question. The clarity, coldness, and apparent purity of water tell you essentially nothing reliable about whether it is safe to drink, and treating clear water as automatically safer than murky water, simply because it looks that way, is exactly the reasoning that put that wagon party on their backs in 1849 and that still sickens a great many hikers, campers, and travelers every single year today. Here's your first thing to carry out of tonight, and I will give you one at the end of every piece. Judge water by its actual treatment, not by its appearance, and treat every natural water source, however clear and however remote from any obvious sign of human activity, as a source that requires proper treatment before you trust it, regardless of how clean your own eyes tell you it looks. Now, why would remote, seemingly pristine mountain country, far from any farm, town, or obvious source of contamination, carry this kind of danger in the first place? This brings me to the second piece, and it explains exactly where this contamination actually comes from, even in the most untouched-looking wilderness a person could imagine. The second piece is understanding the actual natural source of the contamination that makes clear wilderness water genuinely dangerous, because this piece surprises a great many people who assume that danger only follows human activity, farms, towns, and settlements upstream. Wild animals, elk, deer, and above all beaver, which build their dams and lodges directly in and around the exact kind of clear mountain streams travelers find most inviting, carry and shed through their own waste, precisely the organisms responsible for the most common serious waterborne illness in wilderness country, a specific parasite so closely associated with beaver activity in mountain streams that outdoorsmen have long known the resulting sickness by a plain, informal name tied directly to that animal. A stream running through country entirely untouched by any human settlement can carry a real and serious parasite load purely from the ordinary presence of wild animals living exactly the way wild animals have always lived along exactly that kind of water, which means remoteness from human activity offers no real protection at all against this particular danger, a fact that runs against another strong and understandable instinct that untouched wilderness ought to represent the cleanest, safest water available anywhere. This is precisely the trap, and it is a cruel one because it means the very quality that makes a mountain stream feel most trustworthy, its remoteness and its apparent distance from any human contamination, does nothing whatsoever to protect against the specific danger most likely to actually be present in exactly that kind of water. A traveler reasoning that a stream running through wilderness far from any town must surely be cleaner than water drawn near a settlement is reasoning about the wrong category of contamination entirely, protecting themselves perhaps against certain industrial or human waste concerns while remaining completely exposed to the natural animal-borne contamination that wilderness water actually tends to carry in real abundance. It is worth understanding just how thoroughly beaver activity in particular shaped this danger across the exact kind of country those wagon parties were crossing, because beaver were, at that point in this country's history, present in genuinely enormous numbers throughout the Mountain West, their dams and lodges built directly into the very streams travelers relied on most heavily for fresh water, precisely because those same dammed, slowed sections of stream offered the calmest, easiest places to fill a barrel or water a team of animals. A beaver dam creates exactly the kind of still, slow-moving pool where waste and the organisms it carries can settle and persist far longer than in a fast-moving mountain current, which means the calmest, most convenient, most inviting-looking stretch of any given stream, precisely the stretch a tired traveling party would naturally choose to draw water from, was very often also the exact stretch most heavily contaminated by the beaver activity responsible for creating that calm water in the first place. The very feature that made a stretch of water convenient and appealing to draw from was, in a real and direct sense, the same feature that made it more likely to be dangerous, a cruel piece of irony that no traveler of that era had any way of understanding at the time. This connection was eventually understood well enough by later generations of outdoorsmen and mountain travelers that the resulting illness carries, in common outdoor language even today, a name tied directly to that animal, a piece of folk knowledge that developed gradually over the generations following that 1849 wagon party, long after the parties who suffered from it in those early years had any framework for understanding why their beautiful, convenient mountain water had turned on them. Remote and pristine-looking country offers no real protection against the specific waterborne danger most likely to actually be present in exactly that kind of water, because that danger comes from wild animals living naturally in and around the water, not from human settlement and a mountain stream running through the most untouched wilderness in this whole country deserves exactly the same careful treatment as water drawn from any other natural source. No exceptions made simply because the surrounding land looks wild and clean. Now, if a person does drink contaminated water without proper treatment, what does that actually look like in the body in the days that follow? And why did it take that 1849 wagon party as long as it did to connect their own sickness back to that beautiful mountain stream? This is the third piece, and it covers a genuinely important detail about timing that trips up a great many people, then and now. The third piece is the honest, documented progression of symptoms following exposure to contaminated water, and it comes with a piece of timing information that explains exactly why so many people, including that wagon party, struggled to connect their sickness back to the specific water that actually caused it. The parasite most commonly associated with clear mountain water contamination does not typically produce symptoms immediately after exposure. There is very often a real delay, commonly stretching anywhere from about 1 to 3 weeks after the water was actually consumed, before the first symptoms of cramping, gas, and watery persistent diarrhea begin to appear. A delay long enough that a person or a whole traveling party may have moved on to an entirely different camp, filled their water from an entirely different source several times over, and eaten a dozen different meals in the meantime, making it genuinely difficult, without specific knowledge of that delay, to trace the illness back to its actual origin with any confidence at all. This delay is precisely why that wagon party, and many parties like it, blamed the mountain air, a sudden change in diet, or simple bad luck, rather than the specific stream they had drawn from a week or more earlier, because human nature naturally looks for a cause close in time to an effect, and a delay stretching into weeks defeats that natural instinct almost completely. Beyond the cramping and watery diarrhea, a genuine bout of this kind of contamination frequently brings persistent fatigue, sometimes stretching on for a good while, even after the more acute digestive symptoms begin to ease, along with a notable loss of appetite and, in poorly managed cases, real and dangerous dehydration, particularly serious for a traveling party without ready access to clean replacement fluids or any real medical care. Here is the rule, and it is 3 lines the same shape as always. 1. Cramping and watery persistent diarrhea appearing anywhere from roughly a week to 3 weeks after drinking any untreated natural water source should be treated as a real possibility connected to that water, even if it seems at first glance like too much time has passed for the two to be related. 2. Persistent fatigue and appetite loss following that kind of digestive illness, sometimes lingering well beyond the acute symptoms themselves, is a genuine part of the same documented pattern, not a separate or unrelated problem. 3. Any of this illness in genuinely remote conditions without ready access to real medical care calls for aggressive attention to hydration above nearly everything else because the digestive symptoms themselves, while miserable, are rarely what actually endangers a person's life. Severe dehydration resulting from days of persistent fluid loss is the real danger, and it deserves to be treated with real seriousness rather than simply waited out. Gideon carried a particular seriousness around this exact timing detail because the friend he lost as a young man had, by his own account, dismissed an early bout of cramping as nothing more than a poor meal, never once connecting it back to a clear, cold spring the two of them had drunk from together nearly 2 weeks before, and by the time the real severity of that illness became clear, real medical help was simply too far away to reach in time. Gideon told me that story plainly and without embellishment more than once over the years, not to frighten me away from wild water entirely, because he loved these hills and their springs as much as any man I have ever known, but to make certain I understood that a delay of days or weeks between drinking untreated water and falling ill was not evidence the water was innocent. It was, in a great many real cases, exactly what genuine contamination actually looks like. So there is your third thing to carry. Learn the honest timing, symptoms that can appear a week or more after exposure rather than immediately, and treat any unexplained digestive illness following recent time in the outdoors as a real possibility connected to water you may have drunk considerably earlier than instinct would suggest looking. Now, here is where I have to break the pattern of this story for a moment, friend, because everything I have told you so far, why clarity fools the eye, why remote water carries real natural risk, and the honest delayed timing of symptoms is knowledge that explains the danger plainly. What comes next is the specific, understandable mistake that kept this danger alive even among travelers who genuinely understood they ought to be boiling their water. Because knowing water needs treatment and actually treating it correctly turned out to be two very different things. The fourth piece is the false fix, and it describes a mistake made not by careless travelers, but by careful ones, people who genuinely understood they ought to boil suspect water and believed quite reasonably that they were doing exactly that. Here is the false fix laid out plain. A traveler, understanding that murky, obviously suspect water needs boiling, applies that same rough, unmeasured boiling habit inconsistently, boiling water drawn from an obviously questionable source thoroughly and carefully, while treating water from a source that looks clear and pristine with a much shorter, more casual boil, or in some cases skipping the boiling step for that clear water entirely, reasoning understandably but incorrectly that water already looking that clean surely needs less treatment or none at all compared to water that looks visibly dirty. This is precisely the same wheel I have described to you in other pieces on this channel, a reasonable seeming shortcut that actively defeats the very precaution a person believes they are taking. A traveler who boils muddy river water for a full, careful stretch of time while giving a clear mountain stream only the briefest token boil or none at all has not actually protected themselves any better than a traveler who boiled nothing whatsoever, because, as we established in the first piece, the clarity of that mountain water tells them nothing reliable about the actual microscopic danger it may be carrying. The false fix here is specifically the belief that different looking water deserves different unequal treatment, when in fact every natural water source, regardless of appearance, deserves exactly the same complete and proper treatment, no exceptions granted on the basis of how clean the water happens to look to the naked eye. Here is your fourth thing to carry, and it runs directly against the instinct the first piece already warned you about, reinforced here because it is exactly the instinct that causes real practical failures even among people who already know better in the abstract. Treat every single natural water source with the exact same full, proper boiling process with no exceptions made for water that looks especially clean, especially cold, or especially remote from any obvious sign of contamination. The moment a person starts making exceptions based on appearance, they have already fallen back into the exact trap the first piece described, regardless of how much they genuinely understand about the danger in principle. Now, assuming a person commits to boiling every water source properly and completely, what does that boiling actually have to accomplish in specific physical terms to genuinely make water safe? That is the fifth piece, and it leads directly into the exact physics that failed that 1849 wagon party without their ever understanding why. The fifth piece is the actual correct boiling process, described plainly enough that you could follow it exactly the next time you find yourself needing to treat natural water. And it comes down to two specific requirements working together: temperature and time, rather than either one alone. Water has to actually reach a genuine full rolling boil, vigorous bubbling breaking continuously across the entire surface, not merely small bubbles forming along the bottom of the pot or a gentle simmer that never quite develops into true sustained boiling. A great many people, in a hurry or working over a weak fire, pull their water off the heat the moment the first small bubbles appear, well before the water has actually reached a genuine rolling boil. And that water, however hot it may feel, has very likely not reached the temperature required to reliably kill the organisms responsible for serious illness. Once that genuine rolling boil is actually achieved, it needs to be maintained continuously boiling for a specific length of time, and this is where the second requirement, time, comes in alongside temperature. Public health guidance developed and refined over the 20th century after real scientific study of exactly how long dangerous organisms can survive at boiling temperature, settled on a rolling boil maintained for a full minute as sufficient to make water safe under most ordinary conditions. This is not an especially long time, and a great many people, out of an abundance of caution or simply out of not knowing the actual studied requirement, boil their water for considerably longer than necessary, which causes no harm beyond wasted fuel and wasted time, but understanding that a full minute of genuine rolling boil is the actual scientifically established requirement helps a traveler manage their fuel and their time wisely, rather than either dangerously undertreating their water or unnecessarily overtreating it. Here is where the story of that 1849 wagon party finally makes complete sense, and it is the piece of real physics almost nobody, then or now, properly understands. Water does not boil at the same temperature everywhere on this earth. The temperature at which water reaches a full rolling boil depends directly on the surrounding air pressure, and air pressure drops steadily as elevation increases, which means water boils at a genuinely lower actual temperature the higher up a mountain a person happens to be, even though it still looks, sounds, and behaves exactly like a full rolling boil to the naked eye. At sea level, water boils at roughly 212 degrees Fahrenheit, but climb up into real mountain country, the kind of high country that 1849 wagon party was crossing, and that same vigorous, genuine rolling boil may actually be occurring at a temperature several degrees lower. Water that looks and behaves exactly like the boiling those travelers had always trusted at lower elevation, while actually reaching a meaningfully lower peak temperature than the water they were used to boiling back in the lowlands they had left behind. This matters directly for how long that boil needs to be maintained, because the organisms boiling is meant to kill are somewhat more resistant to survival at these slightly lower temperatures found at higher elevation, which is precisely why modern public health guidance specifically recommends extending the boiling time at real elevation a full 3 minutes of genuine rolling boil at elevations above roughly 6,500 feet, rather than the 1 minute sufficient at lower elevations to compensate for that real measurable drop in peak boiling temperature. That 1849 wagon party, climbing into exactly this kind of high country, was very likely boiling their water for the same rough length of time they had always used at lower elevation, achieving what looked and felt like exactly the same thorough boil they had always trusted, while the actual physics of their own mountain fire was quietly working against them the whole time, delivering real heat and a real rolling boil, but at a temperature just low enough, for just long enough, to leave some portion of the organisms in that water still capable of making a person seriously ill. There is one more piece of practical craft worth adding here, a step that complements proper boiling rather than replacing it, and it addresses a piece of water quality that boiling itself does nothing to fix. Boiling kills the living organisms present in water, but it does nothing whatsoever to remove sediment, fine particulate matter, or the cloudiness that genuinely dirty water often carries. And heavily sediment-laden water, even after a full, correct boil, can remain unpleasant to drink and in some cases can actually shield certain organisms within tiny particles of debris in a way that makes the boiling process somewhat less reliably thorough than it would be in cleaner water. Careful old-timers address this by pre-filtering visibly dirty water before ever setting it over the fire, straining it through several layers of clean cloth, or, where time and materials allowed, building a simple layered filter of sand, charcoal, and gravel packed into a hollow log or a cloth bag, allowing water to pass through slowly and emerge considerably clearer on the other side. I want to be honest and precise about exactly what this old filtering step accomplishes and what it does not, because it would be dishonest to let you believe a cloth or a sand filter alone makes water safe to drink. Filtering removes visible sediment and can reduce the particulate load a person is drinking, making the water more pleasant, and in some real cases, making a subsequent boil somewhat more thorough and reliable. But filtering through cloth or a simple sand layer does not reliably remove the microscopic organisms themselves, which are in most cases considerably smaller than the gaps in any homemade filter of that kind. Boiling remains the essential step that actually makes water safe from a biological standpoint, and any pre-filtering ought to be understood as a genuinely useful complement to proper boiling, improving the water's clarity and taste, rather than any kind of substitute for the boiling process itself. Bring your water to a genuine full rolling boil, vigorous bubbling across the entire surface, not a gentle simmer or scattered bubbles along the bottom of the pot. Maintain that genuine rolling boil for a full minute at ordinary elevations. And if you find yourself in real mountain country, above roughly 6,500 feet of elevation, extend that boiling time to a full 3 minutes, understanding that your own fire at that altitude is achieving real boiling at a genuinely lower peak temperature than it would back at sea level, regardless of how identical that boil looks and sounds to the boiling you are used to. That is the full correct process, and it would have made all the difference to a wagon party climbing into high country in 1849 if only the physics behind it had been properly understood by anybody crossing that ground at the time. Now here is another pattern break, friend, because we are at the edge of the last piece, and I want you square with me before we step over it. Everything so far, why clarity fools the eye, why remote water carries real risk, the honest timing of symptoms, the false fix of unequal treatment, and the full correct method of boiling water properly at any elevation is knowledge built up through real, hard-won historical experience and later confirmed by careful scientific study. What comes next is the honest history of why this knowledge, once essential for every single household in this country, quietly became something most people no longer needed to carry in their own heads at all. The sixth piece, the last piece, is the plain, unremarkable history of why proper water treatment knowledge faded from common household awareness, and unlike some of the other stories I have told you on this channel, this fading has no villain in it at all. The specific physics behind why boiling makes water safe, the killing of microscopic organisms through sustained exposure to sufficient heat, was not properly understood in scientific terms until the work of researchers studying germ theory in the later 1800s, work that, over the following decades, gradually turned a rough, trusted folk practice into a precisely understood and measurable process, complete with the specific altitude adjustments I just walked you through, refined further through the 20th century as public health science matured considerably. For the first time in this country's history, ordinary people finally had a genuinely correct, scientifically confirmed explanation for a practice their own grandparents had trusted largely on faith and hard experience alone. And then, across roughly that same span of decades, something else happened that made carrying this specific knowledge in every single household's own head considerably less urgent than it had ever been before. American towns and cities over the course of the 20th century built out genuinely reliable public water treatment infrastructure, filtration and chlorination systems designed and operated by trained professionals, delivering water to household taps that had already been treated correctly and reliably by people whose entire job was understanding exactly this kind of science before it ever reached an ordinary family's kitchen sink. A household drawing water from a municipal tap simply no longer needed to personally understand rolling boils, altitude adjustments, and the honest limits of visual water inspection, because that whole body of responsibility had shifted onto a public system built specifically to handle it correctly. At a scale and with a level of professional oversight no individual household boiling water over their own kitchen stove could ever fully replicate on their own. This is not a story of anybody bearing good knowledge for profit, and I want to be as honest with you about that as Gideon always was with me. It is a story of two entirely reasonable developments, better science and better infrastructure, arriving together and genuinely reducing how much an ordinary household needed to think about a danger their own great-grandparents thought about constantly. The knowledge itself never stopped being true or useful. It simply stopped being urgent for most people, most of the time tucked away as background information rather than daily necessity, right up until the exact moment a person finds themselves away from that reliable public system, filling a bottle from a stream, a spring, or any other natural source, exactly the moment this old knowledge becomes every bit as essential as it ever was to a wagon party crossing high country in 1849. So that is the sixth piece, the honest heart of the whole thing. Clear water is not safe water, and treating it as automatically safer than obviously murky water is a natural but genuinely dangerous instinct that has nothing to do with the real invisible contamination water actually carries. Remote, pristine-looking wilderness offers no protection at all against the natural animal-borne contamination that makes up the most common danger in exactly that kind of water. Illness from contaminated water often does not appear for a week or more, which is precisely why so many people, then and now, fail to connect their own sickness back to the actual water that caused it, treating different-looking water unequally, boiling suspect water carefully, while shortchanging clear water, defeats the whole purpose of boiling in the first place. And the actual correct method, a genuine rolling boil maintained for a full minute at ordinary elevation, extended to 3 minutes above roughly 6,500 feet, is precise, learnable, and would have saved that 1849 wagon party a great deal of suffering if only the physics of their own mountain fire had been properly understood at the time. There is one more thing worth telling you before I close out tonight, because it shows how deeply Gideon carried this particular lesson into the ordinary rhythms of his own household, long after any wagon train had crossed this country, and long after municipal water systems had made the whole question largely academic for most Americans. Gideon kept a spring on his own land his whole life, a clear, cold source he trusted completely for the taste and the character it gave his coffee, and he never once, not a single time across his entire adult life, drew from that spring without bringing it to a full rolling boil first, regardless of how many decades that same spring had already proven itself safe. He told me once that a lifetime of a source behaving well was never by itself a reason to stop treating it properly, because the day a person's guard finally comes down is very often exactly the day circumstances happen to be different from every day before it, whether from a dead animal upstream he never saw or simply bad luck he had no way to predict. That discipline, applied evenly and without exception to a source he trusted more than any other water on this earth, is the truest measure of how seriously he took the lesson his own lost friend had taught him so many years before. Because that wagon party had plenty of water, more than enough to drink their fill from a stream that looked, by every honest measure their own eyes could offer, as pure as any water in this whole country. It was about the difference between water that looks safe and water that has actually been made safe, and that difference is exactly what separated the parties who came through high mountain country healthy from the ones who did not, entirely apart from how much water either party actually had access to along the way. If you ever find yourself filling a bottle from a stream, a spring, or any other natural source, you will not judge that water by how clear or how remote it looks. You will bring it to a genuine, full rolling boil, hold it there for the correct length of time for your own elevation, and trust the process rather than your own eyes. The same careful, hard-won respect for water that Gideon carried with him every single day of his life, respect built on real loss and real understanding, that I hope you carry forward from tonight as well. Done by hand, told straight.